6,703 names, printed, stacked, and sealed in a folder no one in Washington wanted to open, until one senator did. J.D. Vance walked into that Senate hearing with nothing but a list and a question. He didn't shout. He didn't wave his hands. He just stood there holding a photo of a 10-year-old girl who never made it to 5th grade. Then he asked, "If that were your child, would you still defend an open border?" The room didn't explode. It froze. Cameras kept rolling, but no one moved. Behind every political mask, something cracked. Even if no one said a word. Not in that moment. Because when truth is sharp enough, it doesn't need to echo. It just needs 1 second of silence to cut through everything. Now, before we dive in, a note. This is a dramatized retelling based on real issues, real pain, and real policies. The characters and moments you're about to witness are fictionalized for impact, but the emotions, the stakes, and the questions are all heartbreakingly real. So ask yourself, what kind of country lets 6,703 names fall through the cracks and then calls it compassion? Stay with us. Some questions deserve more than headlines. They deserve your time. The hearing room was colder than it should have been. Maybe it was the marble walls. Or maybe it was the silence that fell the moment J.D. Vance stepped inside. Cameras clicked once, then stopped. He didn't rush to his seat. He didn't look around. He walked straight down the center aisle, eyes steady, suit pressed, holding a thick manila folder in his left hand. Heavy, slightly creased, corners frayed like it had been opened and closed 100 times. To the casual observer, it looked like just another hearing on border security. Another row of nameplates, another scripted exchange between senators and bureaucrats. But there was something different in the air today, something electric, something loaded. At the far end of the panel sat 3 high-ranking officials from the Department of Homeland Security. They wore practiced expressions, measured concern, soft confidence, the kind of faces trained to survive 10 hours of testimony without blinking. They had answers prepared, charts ready, and phrases like complicated dynamics, interagency collaboration, and humanitarian approach stacked neatly in their opening remarks. But they weren't ready for what was coming. J.D. waited. Patiently, he let them talk first. For 18 minutes, the committee heard words, dozens of them, about migration trends, resource constraints, and the importance of compassion. One official used the phrase multi-layered solution 6 times. Another claimed that the recent surge in border crossings was within anticipated seasonal fluctuation. J.D. didn't interrupt. He just opened the folder and pulled out a list. No introduction, no preface, just the sound of paper being unfolded. Slowly, carefully, the way someone might unfold a flag before a burial. The list was long, printed single space, 3 columns per page, over 6,000 names. J.D. didn't look at the officials. He didn't look at the cameras. He looked at the list, then placed it on the witness table, deliberately right next to a glass pitcher of untouched water and a microphone that suddenly felt far too loud. Silence. Then softly, "These aren't statistics," J.D. said. "They aren't numbers. They aren't data points." He paused, eyes still on the paper. "They're names, real people, parents, sons, daughters, dead. Not because of border policy, but because of border failure. Because of illegal entry routes that cartel smugglers use every single day." A few senators shifted in their seats. One aide stopped typing. J.D. looked up, finally, and locked eyes with the lead DHS official. "What happens in Yuma, Arizona doesn't stay in Yuma. It spreads, it kills people in my state, in yours, in towns you've never heard of, because no one covers the funerals of the forgotten." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something else. Folded, aged, personal. A photo. A teenage girl with braces, smiling wide, holding a softball trophy. Emily Miller, 15 years old, Portsmouth, Ohio, bought what she thought was a pain pill from a classmate. 1 pill, laced with fentanyl. She was dead before her mom even made it up the stairs. The room was dead silent. Her classmate got the pills from someone who came through an illegal checkpoint 2 states away. That's not an accident. That's a system. JD's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The quiet made his words louder. I've listened to this committee for over an hour now. I've heard the same phrases recycled like plastic, but I haven't heard a single name. Not one. He tapped the list. So I brought them for you. He pushed the list forward, gently, as if handing over a loaded weapon. 6,703 names, and that's just this year. The DHS official shifted in his chair, glancing at the list, then quickly away. Another official cleared her throat but said nothing. JD leaned back slightly, his voice soft but firm. These aren't overdose victims. They're collateral damage, casualties of a failed border. And if we keep calling this compassion, we're going to need a much longer list. He let that hang in the air. No dramatic exit, no mic drop, just stillness. And in that stillness, something shifted. Not in policy, maybe, but in perception. Because in that moment, J.D. Vance didn't sound like a politician. He sounded like a father. And whether the room wanted to admit it or not, every person there understood. The border wasn't just a line on a map anymore. It was a question. One they were all too afraid to answer. But for J.D., those names weren't just typed on a page. They had mothers, memories, and stories. And one of them began in a quiet town in Ohio. 3 days before the hearing, J.D. had driven 5 hours in silence to a town most senators had never heard of, Portsmouth, Ohio. Once a proud hub for steel and shipping, now hollowed out by factory closures and something far worse, pills that didn't look dangerous until they killed. He pulled into a cracked driveway just after dusk. The porch light was on, but barely. A woman waited by the screen door. No makeup, no pretense, just the kind of weariness that had no name, only wait. "Senator Vance?" she asked. He nodded once. "Angela." She stepped aside and waved him in. The living room was quiet, dimly lit, a folded blanket on the couch. A quilt hung on the wall, stitched with the names of local overdose victims. J.D. noticed the same name twice. "He was 17, Angela said, already holding the report. She handed it to him like it burned her hands. A thin folder, police case number scrawled on the front. Inside, toxicology results, a photo of the pill, and a one-line statement that stopped J.D. cold. Dealer claimed product came straight from the southern border. J.D. read it again. The quote was in quotation marks, documented, not just a rumor. Angela spoke quietly, staring at the floor. "They said it was just fentanyl. Just one pill. He took it after school in his room. Didn't wake up." She walked over to a small bookshelf, opened a worn album, and pulled out a photo. It was her son, Luke, a messy-haired, bright-eyed kid wearing a Cleveland Browns hoodie, standing in front of a Christmas tree. He was holding up a driver's permit, grinning like he'd just been handed the keys to the world. She placed the photo into J.D.'s hand and sat back down, eyes wet but unwavering. "He wanted to join the army," she said. "Said he didn't want to be stuck here forever. Said he wanted to fight for something that mattered." J.D. stared at the photo, then slowly slid it into his coat pocket. Angela didn't cry. She just looked tired in a way that came from surviving too long in a country that didn't know how to grieve the forgotten. "I've been to the Capitol," she said. "Watched the hearings. They talk about borders like it's some abstract problem, like it's math. But that pill crossed a border, then it crossed my kitchen table, and then it crossed into his bloodstream." She paused, then looked directly at J.D., her voice suddenly sharper, more certain. "Don't let them forget him." J.D. nodded. No speeches, no promises, just a small, honest nod, the kind that binds you to something more than politics. When he left the house, the air was cold and clear. He sat in his car for a long time without turning the engine. He didn't rehearse his opening remarks, didn't check notes. He just took out Luke's photo and placed it on the passenger seat beside the list. It looked small next to 6,703 names, but in that moment, it meant more than all of them. Because it wasn't just data anymore. It was a boy, a border, and a mother who refused to let anyone look away. And J.D. knew, when he walked into that hearing, he wouldn't be speaking alone. He'd be carrying a voice that D.C. had ignored for too long. The next morning, JD sat alone in his Senate office. Lights dimmed, tie loosened, the city humming distantly beyond the glass. He had slept just 3 hours. The photo of Luke sat on the edge of his desk, next to the list of 6,703 names. But today he had something else in front of him. Something colder, heavier. A map. It stretched across his entire desk, pinned at the corners with law books and coffee mugs. Red dots marked the places: Middletown, Akron, Wilkes-Barre, Lexington, East Palestine, Broken Bow, Decatur. 15 towns in total, each thousands of miles from the southern border, yet each connected by something the nightly news rarely mentioned. Overdose deaths linked directly to stash houses operated by cartel coyotes. These weren't random tragedies. They were mapped. Each red dot came with a case file JD had read. Each one had the same phrase tucked deep in the police reports or DEA memos. Pill origin traced to cartel-linked trafficking route, entered via illegal crossing. 15 dots, 15 towns, 15 communities that never made it to the headline crawl at the bottom of the screen. JD leaned over the map, tracing a line with his finger, from the Rio Grande up through Lubbock to St. Louis, then into Appalachia. It wasn't theoretical anymore. It was infrastructure. Highways of death built not with concrete but with silence. In one folder there was an email from a local sheriff in Indiana. It read, "They don't come across the border carrying backpacks full of pills. They come through coyotes, drop in stash houses, then disappear into towns like mine. We catch one, and 10 more take his place." JD closed the folder. He had seen enough. He stood, walked over to the office wall, and pinned the map in full view, directly opposite his desk. A red thread now connected the dots like arteries, bleeding out from the border in all directions. The word crisis wasn't enough anymore. He stared at the map for a long moment, then quietly said it out loud, almost to himself. This isn't a policy failure. It's national negligence. And there it was, the line. Not a slogan, not a soundbite, a sentence pulled from the gut, the kind of sentence that made rooms go silent. He picked up Luke's photo again, held it beside the map. One boy, one pill, one town, and one system that let it all happen. Then he glanced back at the list. 6,703 red dots that hadn't been drawn yet. That hearing, he knew, wasn't going to change everything. Not overnight, maybe not ever. But the first step in fixing a lie is saying it out loud. And tomorrow he planned to say it loud enough that no one in the Capitol could pretend they hadn't heard. The stage was set in a downtown DC University auditorium, but the air felt more like a courtroom. Red velvet chairs filled with students, veterans, reporters, and campaign staffers, all waiting for what had been advertised as a civil exchange on immigration and national security. But JD Vance didn't come to be civil. He came to draw a line. The moderator opened with scripted pleasantries, then gestured to Senator Daniel Whitmore, a polished third-term Democrat known for his calm tone and humanitarian rhetoric. Whitmore leaned forward with a measured smile and began with familiar language. "What we're seeing at the southern border is not an invasion," he said, voice smooth, practiced. "It's a humanitarian event. Families, often with children, are fleeing violence and economic collapse. The idea that these people pose a threat to American safety is not supported by the evidence." A polite ripple of applause followed from the left side of the room. JD didn't blink. He waited, hands folded, letting the silence stretch just a moment too long. Then he leaned toward the mic. "Senator," he began, calm but cutting, "you said these families are escaping danger. I'm asking, who's protecting American families from the danger that's coming with them?" There were murmurs now, not applause. Not yet. JD reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thin blue folder, the same kind used in high school report presentations. He opened it slowly. "We have over 100,000 overdose deaths a year. The CDC confirms fentanyl is now the leading cause of death for Americans aged 18 to 45. Where's it coming from? Illegally trafficked routes, piggybacking on the same asylum channels your policies keep wide open." Whitmore held up a hand, already prepared. "You're conflating two different things. Asylum seekers and drug traffickers are not the same people. JD nodded once, then responded, No, they're not, but they're traveling the same roads. And every time we let a group through without proper vetting, we give the cartels cover. They flood the border with families to distract agents, then run the poison behind them. Gasps, audible now. No longer just polite DC disagreement. This was heat. And it's not just theory, it's fact, JD continued. 15 towns, spread across the Midwest and Appalachia, have confirmed fentanyl shipments tied directly to stash houses operating behind asylum drop points. That's not compassion, that's complicity. The moderator attempted to interject, but Whitmore waved him off. With all due respect, Senator Vance, we're a nation of immigrants. We're supposed to lead with heart. JD's tone sharpened. Not louder, just more dangerous in its clarity. Heart without backbone is surrender. And policy without enforcement is not compassion. It's neglect. Every time a town buries a teenager because we were too afraid to tighten our laws, that's not being moral. That's being blind. There was no applause this time, just silence. Heavy. Watching. Waiting. JD pulled out the same photo he'd carried into the hearing. Emily Miller, 15, smiling with her trophy. He held it up, just long enough for the cameras to catch it. She didn't die because we lacked heart, he said quietly. She died because we lacked courage. The moderator called for a break. The live stream cut to commercial, but the clip had already been clipped, time-stamped, uploaded, and shared by the time JD stepped off stage. Some called it political theater, others called it fear-mongering. But for the families in places like Portsmouth and Wilkes-Barre, it wasn't either. It was the first time someone said out loud what they had known for years. The sun in Yuma didn't set. It burned its way down. By the time JD Vance stepped out of the SUV onto the desert soil, the heat was still rising off the sand like a warning. The Border Patrol station sat quiet behind him, surrounded by dust, silence, and steel fencing that stretched farther than the eye could follow. He wasn't here for a photo op. There were no cameras this time, no press release, just 2 agents, a translator, and a perimeter under siege every night by forces no policy could fully tame. Senator, one of the agents said, shaking his hand, you came on a good night. JD raised an eyebrow. Define good. The agent nodded toward the horizon. We intercepted 3 groups in the last hour. 4th one should hit just before dusk. They didn't have to wait long. 15 minutes later, a call came in. Footprints along a dry creek bed. Movement near a break in the fencing where smugglers had bent metal and buried concrete to widen a crawl space. JD followed the agents in silence, boots crunching over cracked brush, the occasional flick of a lizard tail darting into shadow. Then figures in motion, a dozen of them running fast under the last light of day. No luggage, no words, just shapes in sweat-stained shirts, sprinting like their lives depended on it. The agents moved quickly, coordinated, trained, efficient. They caught 10. One disappeared into the rocks, vanishing west with the precision of someone who had done this a dozen times. Coyote, one agent said. Never the same guy twice. But what stopped JD wasn't the 10 arrested. It was the boy, 14, maybe younger, crouched behind a rusted culvert, trembling so hard his teeth clicked. His shoes were falling apart. His shirt was too big for his frame. When they approached, he didn't run. He dropped to his knees and held out both hands like he'd rehearsed it. He's not with family, the lead agent said flatly. No ID, no name, no Spanish. Doesn't know where he is. Probably Honduran or Guatemalan. But he's not here for asylum. JD crouched beside him. The boy wouldn't meet his eyes. He was shaking, lips purple, eyes ringed red from crying, or maybe from desert wind. What's he doing here then? JD asked. The agent didn't blink. He's bait, JD frowned. Cartel tactic, the agent continued. Send a miner alone. We stop to help him. Meanwhile, 10 yards away, they move product or people across. Or worse, fake a surrender, then fire shots. Use sympathy as cover. JD looked at the boy again. Not as a criminal, but as a tool, discarded by a system that only needed him to distract long enough to deliver poison. A moment passed. The boy whispered something, but no one understood it. "We'll take him in," the agent said. "He'll go to a shelter. Maybe, if it's not full." JD stood slowly, brushing dust from his knee. He stared out toward the place where the coyote had vanished. The empty trail, the open wound in the fence, the night rising to hide everything. He finally spoke, low, hard, certain. "This isn't immigration, it's infiltration." No one argued, because down here, there was no theory, no televised debate, no one with cue cards or sound bites. There was just the border, and everything bleeding through it. The diner was nearly empty, save for a flickering TV in the corner, and the smell of burnt coffee that had lingered longer than most customers. J.D. Vance sat across from a man in a worn baseball cap and a jacket that had once carried the CBP insignia. Now it was faded, like everything else about him, except his eyes. Those were sharp as ever. "Thanks for meeting me," J.D. said quietly. The man sipped his coffee, black and bitter, and set the cup down with a heavy clink. "Didn't come to chat," he said. "I came to say what they won't." J.D. waited. No recorder, no staff, just a notepad and the weight of what he'd seen at the fence still pressing on him. The man leaned in. "Every group that crosses illegally is tracked, tagged, and taxed." J.D.'s brow furrowed. "Tracked? Cartels run the border now," the man continued, voice low but unshaken. "They watch every crossing, every coyote, every body, every load. Nothing moves without their okay. If someone crosses illegally and doesn't pay them, either in money or labor, they end up missing. Or dead." J.D. didn't respond. He just kept listening. "You let one in," the man said, tapping the table with two fingers. "You let them all in, because that one was allowed to pay tribute. And his presence tells the cartel, your routes are still open, still profitable, still worth protecting." He pulled something from his coat, a faded photo, printed from a grainy surveillance cam. J.D. leaned forward to study it. A stash house just outside Tucson, windows blacked out, fencing covered in tarps. The date stamp read only 6 days ago. "This house feeds opioids up into Ohio, Kentucky, and West Virginia," the officer said. "They move the product in kids' backpacks, baby formula containers, gas tanks. We shut it down twice. It reopened both times under a new name and a new front." J.D. looked up, trying to speak, but nothing came. The man continued. "The border crisis isn't a humanitarian breakdown. It's a business model, one we're letting flourish because we're too afraid to call it what it is." J.D. stared at the photo again. The house looked ordinary, bland, suburban, forgettable. That made it worse. No crime scene tape, no flashing lights, just another ghost in the system. The officer finished his coffee and stood. "You want to fix it?" he said, grabbing his hat. "Then stop playing defense. The cartel already owns the offense." J.D. remained seated as the man left. Outside, trucks rumbled by on a distant highway. The shadows in the diner shifted, then settled. For the first time in days, J.D. didn't take notes. He didn't highlight reports or rehearse statements. He just sat still. Because what he'd heard wasn't political, it was structural, and it explained what no press conference ever would. This wasn't about borders, it was about ownership. And right now, the wrong hands were holding the keys. The phone rang just after midnight. J.D. was still awake, staring at the map on his wall, the one with the red thread tracing fentanyl's silent route through the heartland. He didn't recognize the number at first, but something in his gut made him answer on the first ring. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was cracked, dry, raw. It took a moment before J.D. recognized it. "Cal?" His cousin didn't respond right away, just breathed hard, like he was trying to keep something from falling apart. Then it came, broken, blunt, final. "He's gone, Jay." J.D. froze. "Tyler, I found him. Just gone." The words landed like stones one by one. Cal had served 2 tours in Afghanistan, came home with scars both visible and hidden. Tyler was his only son. J.D. remembered him as the kid with a slingshot and a wild imagination, always barefoot in the backyard, chasing a world only he could see. "We fought over dinner," Cal said, his voice shaking. "He said he was fine, said he was clean. I told him to quit lying. He stormed off to his room. That was last night. A long pause, then quieter. I buried friends in Kandahar. But nothing feels like this. JD didn't ask what it was. He already knew. Another pill, another fake, another shipment smuggled through a Texas checkpoint by someone with no face and no name. He didn't say, "I'm sorry." That felt hollow now. He said, "I'll be there by morning." He was out the door in 10 minutes. The highway from D.C. to rural Ohio was long and mostly empty. JD drove with one hand on the wheel and the other gripping the folded photo of Tyler from their last family reunion. A blurry image of a teenage boy grinning behind a paper plate stacked with ribs. JD kept seeing that smile, but hearing the words, "He's gone." He didn't turn on the radio. He didn't call staff. This wasn't about press releases or polling bumps. It was about a hole in the ground that didn't have to be there. As dawn crept over the horizon, JD pulled into the driveway of Cal's house. The flag outside was at half-staff. He parked but didn't get out right away. The porch light was still on, faint against the gray light of early morning. It reminded him too much of another porch. Angela's, the mother from Portsmouth. 2 houses, 2 families, same story. Inside, the house was quiet. JD stepped in, and Cal stood in the living room, still wearing yesterday's clothes, holding an empty coffee mug with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. He didn't say a word, just walked over and hugged JD like he hadn't let himself breathe in hours. "They said it was fentanyl," he whispered, "pressed into a Xanax. He probably thought it'd calm him down." JD didn't let go. Later, Cal would show him the coroner's report. JD would quietly add Tyler's name to the list, somewhere near the top. But for now, they just stood there, in the silence of a home that would never sound the same again. Because this wasn't just another name. It was blood. It was family. And it had just crossed the line between political and personal, for good. It rained the morning they buried Tyler. Not a storm, not a cleansing downpour, just a steady, dull drizzle. The kind that seeped into everything without mercy or apology. It turned the Ohio cemetery soil to a soft, stubborn mud and turned suits into sponges. JD stood beside Cal, holding a shared silence as the casket was lowered into the ground. There was no 21-gun salute, no honor guard, no brass playing taps behind a waving line of flags. Tyler hadn't worn a uniform. He never got the chance. But the folded American flag still sat on the casket, only it wasn't for the boy inside. It was for the man standing beside it. Cal had placed his own service flag there that morning, quietly, without explanation. No one asked why. No one dared. The few who gathered under umbrellas and sagging canopies were mostly neighbors, old friends, classmates who hadn't seen Tyler since high school. Their faces held the kind of complicated grief reserved for young funerals. Part sorrow, part guilt, part quiet fear that it could have been them, or their kid, or the boy next door. The preacher spoke softly, his words wet and blurred by the weather. But it was Cal's voice that cut through everything. He stepped forward slowly, hands shaking not from the cold, but from something deeper. A folded sheet of paper in his hand. A eulogy, not prepared, not rehearsed, just written in a midnight haze of heartbreak and anger. "He was a good kid," Cal said, voice rough. "He made dumb choices, like every 17-year-old does. He lied sometimes, got mouthy, pushed boundaries. But he was kind. He loved his dog. He held the door open for strangers. He played guitar so loud it drove me insane." Laughter cracked through tears, thin and brief. "And he's gone. Not because of a war, not because of a car crash, but because of a pill. One pill. That came through a border we're too scared to close." JD felt that line land in his chest like a punch. Around him, shoulders tightened, eyes dropped. The wind picked up slightly, like the world had heard what no one else had dared to say out loud. "I fought overseas to keep danger out," Cal said, eyes locking on the casket. "And now, I bury my son because danger walked right in, and no one stopped it." He didn't cry. Not then. He just folded the paper once, walked to the casket, and placed it gently on top beside the flag that should have been his son's. When the last handful of earth hit the lid, JD stepped forward. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He knelt down, pressed his hand flat against the wood, and quietly whispered, "I won't let them erase you." That night, back in the guest room at Cal's house, JD opened the manila folder again, the same one he had carried to the hearing. The list had grown wrinkled, weathered, smudged by raindrops and coffee and grief. He turned to the back, pulled out a pen, and added the newest name in careful, deliberate script: Tyler Jamison Vance, age 19, Portsmouth, Ohio. The name didn't get a number. Not yet. JD wasn't ready to count it as just one more. He closed the folder and sat back, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind move across the porch, the hum of a town too used to loss. Because for every folded flag, there were dozens that were never folded at all. No honors, no headlines, just silence. And JD knew if this fight was worth anything, it had to start by giving them back their names. 3 days after the funeral, J.D. Vance stood once again on the floor of the United States Senate. He wasn't wearing a different suit. He wasn't holding a new folder. But he carried something heavier than any of it. Grief that hadn't yet hardened into anger, and a truth too sharp to cushion. The chamber was only half full. Some senators scrolled their phones. Others flipped through briefing binders. A few looked up, sensing something in J.D.'s posture that wasn't quite routine. He didn't begin with data. He didn't begin with policy. He began with a name. Tyler Jamison Vance, he said. 19 years old. Just got his driver's license. Wanted to join the Army. Never made it past his own bedroom. There was a pause, the kind that hadn't been written into any schedule. J.D. adjusted the mic slightly, though he didn't need to. He was my cousin's son. He took one counterfeit pill. Thought it was something to calm his nerves. It was fentanyl. He was dead in minutes. Another pause. No shuffling this time. No throat clearing. Just stillness. J.D. continued. That fentanyl didn't parachute in from the sky. It wasn't teleported into our suburbs. It didn't arrive in an Amazon box. His voice sharpened. Not loud, but precise. It was trafficked, hand-carried, walked across our southern border by men who don't stay long enough to get caught, but long enough to destroy a family. He leaned slightly forward, eyes scanning the room. No theatrics, just wait. And we let them in. The last line cracked slightly in his throat. A sliver of emotion escaped, raw, unvarnished, not for cameras, but because his chest couldn't hold it back anymore. We say we care. We hold hearings. We give speeches about compassion and opportunity. But meanwhile, thousands of communities are bearing teenagers who never even knew what hit them. J.D. reached into his inside pocket and pulled out the same folded photo of Tyler. He didn't raise it high. He just held it in front of him, low and quiet, like it didn't need to be seen by everyone, just remembered by someone. This was a boy, a name, a life, and now he's gone because we were too polite to say what needed to be said. A senator across the aisle shifted uncomfortably. J.D. didn't look away. We keep pretending this is about immigration, but this is about infiltration, exploitation, and abdication of duty. He placed the photo gently on the podium and exhaled slowly. We're not failing by accident. We're failing by choice. Silence again. The room wasn't empty, but for the first time all day, it felt like no one was breathing. J.D. gathered his papers but didn't move to leave just yet. He looked up one final time and said it, not with anger, but with a quiet, cutting certainty. Tyler's name is on a list now, alongside thousands of others. And until that list stops growing, don't you dare tell me the border's under control. Then he stepped away. No applause, no soundbite-ready closing. Just a still photograph resting on mahogany and a chair that hadn't grown cold yet. The Senate floor was crowded that day, not just with lawmakers, but with cameras, aides, reporters who suddenly decided this particular hearing on immigration might be worth staying for. J.D. Vance sat at the far end of the semicircle, still, hands clasped, listening without blinking as Senator Lyle Mercer, four-term, silver-haired, camera-polished, delivered his opening remarks. Mercer was everything the press liked, eloquent, calm, rooted in optimism. His voice rolled smooth as velvet across the chamber. Let us not forget, Mercer said, that America has always been a nation of immigrants, that our strength lies in openness, that we must continue to extend a hand to the tired, the poor, the huddled masses. JD didn't flinch. Not yet. We have a moral responsibility, Mercer continued, his tone rising with practiced precision, to be a beacon of hope, not a wall of rejection. Some senators nodded. Others tapped notes on tablets. The cameras panned gently. The lighting was perfect. The scene was polished until JD stood. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't hold papers or stats. He held a photo, a small, creased photo, printed on cheap paper. A 10-year-old girl with a gap-toothed grin, a Halloween costume too big for her frame, and a plastic pumpkin basket clenched in one hand. She was dressed as a butterfly. JD walked slowly to the center microphone. He didn't look at Mercer. He looked straight ahead. Her name was Sophia, 10 years old. She trick-or-treated like any other kid, except the candy she ate was laced with fentanyl. The room tensed. She died before sunrise in her bedroom, with her wings still on. He turned toward Mercer now. Senator Mercer, I respect your passion, but I have one question. He paused, long enough for the silence to settle like ash. If she were your daughter, would you still call it compassion to let strangers pour across an open gate? Mercer didn't respond. Not immediately. JD let the question hang in the air, heavy and unrelenting. Would you still say we must remain open when the openness is being weaponized? When coyotes and smugglers hide behind the same humanitarian rhetoric to push poison into our homes? Now JD raised the photo higher, not with anger, but with something quieter, almost reverent. Because I've seen that poison. I've watched it bury teenagers. I've watched it turn fathers into grave diggers. And I've watched people in this very chamber call it a complicated issue while doing absolutely nothing. Mercer shifted in his seat, visibly uncomfortable. One aide whispered something behind him, but he didn't turn. JD stepped closer. Compassion without control is chaos, and calling it kindness doesn't change the body count. He laid the photo down on the table between them, right in front of Mercer. You call it asylum. I call it abandonment. JD turned, walking back to his seat slowly, the silence behind him pressing like a storm. And until we have the courage to close the gate long enough to clean up the mess, we're not being moral, we're being negligent. He sat down. No one applauded. No one moved. Even the cameras, still rolling, seemed to hesitate, unsure whether to cut away or hold. Across the aisle, Mercer stared at the photo, then blinked once and looked down. JD didn't look at him again, because this wasn't about Mercer anymore. It was about Sophia, a little girl in butterfly wings, and a question no one wanted to answer. The photo lay face up on the mahogany surface. The little girl's smile frozen in innocence, wings askew, costume wrinkled from a night she never finished. Her eyes stared up at a room that didn't know how to look back. JD had returned to his seat, hands folded tightly in his lap. He didn't lean back. He didn't look around. He just waited, and so did everyone else. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was surgical, sharp, intolerably clean. Senator Mercer, still seated beside the photo, kept his eyes locked on the table, jaw tight. His usual calm had vanished. The confident, polished cadence he wore like armor in every hearing had fractured, quietly, visibly. A junior aide behind him blinked in disbelief, as if waiting for a cue that didn't come. Another aide whispered, "Should we say something?" to no one in particular. Across the chamber, a veteran Capitol Hill reporter, someone who'd covered 10 administrations and had stopped being surprised long ago, mouthed a single word to her colleague without lifting her pen. Wow. One camera zoomed slightly, refocused, then just held. The photo, the senator, the silence. It didn't need commentary, because no one said a word, not for 21 seconds. And in a place where time is scheduled to the minute, 21 seconds is an eternity. The silence grew so thick that the air seemed to stop moving. A bead of sweat rolled down the back of Mercer's neck. He didn't wipe it. JD didn't move. No one dared interrupt what was happening, because it wasn't just a pause in proceedings. It was a fracture in control. And when the gavel finally came down, it felt like an afterthought. "Order," the committee chair said flatly, more to himself than anyone else. "Order, please." But the moment had already ruptured beyond repair. Order was no longer the dominant force in the room. Truth was. As the next senator cleared his throat and stumbled into a new line of questioning, something about visa backlogs, half the room was still thinking about the butterfly wings, still seeing a casket far smaller than it should have been, still hearing a question that hadn't been answered. Outside the chamber, the ripple became a wave. Video clips, unedited and raw, hit Twitter within minutes. The full exchange went viral before the committee even recessed. Headlines appeared before lunch. Vance stuns Senate with one question. Butterfly girl stops immigration hearing cold. No one dared answer, but inside the chamber, none of that mattered. JD didn't smile. He didn't nod at the coverage. He didn't acknowledge the weight of what had just happened. He just lowered his head for a moment, letting the silence settle into his bones. Because sometimes it isn't the argument that wins, it's the stillness after. By nightfall, the footage had looped on every major cable network. Some ran the full clip, silence and all. Others clipped it down to JD's searing question, just 9 words, and framed it with breaking banners. Senator's accusation stuns chamber. Commentators shouted over one another. On one network, JD was praised as the only one brave enough to say what millions think but are too afraid to ask. On another, he was branded a performative demagogue, exploiting grief for political gain. It didn't matter. The moment had landed, and no one could unhear it. Social media fractured overnight. Hashtags surged. Hashtag butterfly question. Hashtag 21 seconds. Hashtag if it were your child. Within hours, the girl's photo, wings and all, was etched into the conscience of the country. News anchors debated JD's motives. Was he weaponizing a tragedy? Or had he finally forced Washington to look where it refused to see? Inside the Capitol, reactions split down familiar lines. Some senators avoided eye contact with JD in the hallways. Others offered a curt nod, respect without endorsement. A handful stopped him with quiet sincerity. That took guts. But JD didn't bask in the attention. He didn't tweet. He didn't call press conferences. He returned to his office, removed a framed certificate from the wall, and replaced it with the girl's photo. He didn't add a plaque, no spotlight, just a single line written in pen below the frame. One question, no answer. The staff noticed the shift. His chief of staff paused the first time she saw it, her breath catching in her throat. No one asked about it. No one needed to. It had become his North Star and his weight. Later that week, when reporters cornered him on the Capitol steps, asking if he regretted going so far, JD paused before replying. If the room had answered, we wouldn't be here. They pressed on. Are you accusing fellow senators of having blood on their hands? I'm accusing them of silence, he said quietly. And in this country, silence kills more than it comforts. Behind the scenes, pressure mounted. Advocacy groups flooded inboxes, some furious, some grateful. A grieving mother from Utah sent a handwritten card. I don't know politics, she wrote, but I know what fentanyl took from me. Thank you for not letting them forget. That card joined the photo on his wall. Across town, in studios and green rooms, strategists spun. J.D. Vance had thrown a moral grenade into the middle of a bipartisan stalemate, and now no one could pretend it hadn't gone off. But back in his office, in the quiet, he didn't hear the noise. Just the question, still echoing, still unanswered. The backlash came fast and loud. JD's voicemail was flooded by the hour. Disgrace, racist, exploiter. Protesters began circling his Senate office with handmade signs and bullhorns. Some painted the girl's photo on posters, but twisted the message, stop using dead kids for votes. News networks speculated whether his words had crossed a moral line. One anchor said flatly, J.D. Vance weaponized a child's death. That isn't courage, it's cruelty. Security tightened around his office. Staff were told to enter through side doors. Social media was worse. Death threats, doxing attempts. His wife's Facebook page was hacked, and someone had left a syringe emoji on a photo of his son. J.D. read every message once, then turned off notifications. But as the noise outside grew, something else started arriving. Quiet, steady, and handwritten. Letters, not emails, not tweets, but envelopes. Dozens, then hundreds. Eventually they came in crates, from New Hampshire, from El Paso, from a coal town in West Virginia. Mothers, grandfathers, retired teachers, EMTs. Some were a single sentence. Thank you for saying what we've been screaming into the dark. Others were pages long, detailing stories JD could barely bring himself to finish. A father from Kansas wrote, "My son was 16. They said it was just pain pills. It wasn't. I buried him with his guitar." One envelope was from an inmate in a Tennessee prison, written in pencil on lined paper. "I sold fentanyl. I crossed twice. I watched boys your son's age drop. You were right to ask that question. No one ever asked us that before." JD kept that one in his desk drawer. Then came the letter that stopped him cold. A sheriff from Cochise County, Arizona. JD didn't know him, had never met him, but the handwriting was sharp and deliberate. The sheriff had enclosed a photo of his department's evidence board, faces, strings, maps. JD had seen similar setups in intelligence briefings. The note read, "We've lost deputies to this war. We've buried kids. We've raided stash houses that look like they belong in Baghdad. And we've been told to mind our tone." You said it out loud. Finally, thank you. JD stared at the letter for a long time, then wordlessly pinned it beside the girl's photo. Outside, headlines blared about the danger of inflammatory rhetoric. Cable debates exploded over whether JD's words had stirred division. But the letters kept coming, like quiet testimony. Real stories, real names. He held a town hall in Columbus the following week. Protesters shouted in the parking lot, but inside, a mother in a denim jacket stood up with trembling hands. She didn't mention fentanyl. She just held up her phone. The wallpaper was her son. 16, she whispered. He smiled like that the morning they found him. She sat down, said nothing more. JD didn't reply with a speech. He just nodded and swallowed hard. In the car ride back, his staffer asked quietly, "Do you regret it?" JD shook his head. "No, because before, they didn't write. They didn't stand. Now they do." The backlash hadn't broken him. It had revealed something else. That under the noise, beneath the slogans and spins, was a silence far more powerful. The silence of people who had lost everything and finally saw someone say what they couldn't. And that silence had just found its voice. It came in a white envelope with no return address, postmarked from El Paso. Inside, the handwriting was neat, deliberate, almost clinical. It began without pleasantries. "I'm a trauma nurse at a border clinic. I've worked 17 years. I've stopped counting how many kids we've patched up after cartel crossings." JD sat at his desk in silence, reading every word aloud to himself. "We've treated 6-year-olds with broken ribs, girls who won't speak. One boy had burn marks on his hands. They said he was used as a distraction while smugglers pushed drugs through another route." The letter was signed only, "A nurse who sees what they ignore." For a few moments, JD didn't move. The office was quiet, the kind of silence that demands action. He didn't wait for press clearance. He hit go live. The live stream lit up within seconds. No opening statement, just his face, tired but steady, as he began to read. "I've seen 6-year-olds trafficked and abandoned. That's not immigration. That's a war crime." He paused, let the silence hang. Then, "Those are not my words. That's a nurse. On the front lines. In a clinic we barely fund." In real time, comments flooded the screen. Some in support, others full of rage. But JD didn't flinch. What kind of system lets children be used as bait? What kind of compassion ignores the blood on the sand, so long as it's not on TV? He placed the letter beside the girl's photo on the wall. The nurse had attached a photocopy of a triage report. The patient, male, approximately 6 years old, abandoned near highway, contusions, malnourished, incoherent. JD held it up. That child didn't vote. That child didn't choose a side. He was thrown into this by cartels who know our gates stay open just long enough. A staffer stepped in, whispering, "You might want to vet the source." JD's reply was firm. "I just did." She's seen the scars. That's the only credential that matters today. The live stream ran just over 9 minutes. It was shared over 2 million times in 2 days. The media framed it as another emotional appeal. But for the families watching from living rooms and clinics across the country, it was something else. It was a breach in the silence. That night, JD received a message through his secure channel. Another nurse, same clinic, confirming the story. She's real, she cries in the break room. And every time a new child comes in, she asks, "Where's the outrage?" JD stared at his wall. Photos, names, the hand-pinned quote. One question, no answer. Then he reached for a pen and wrote a new one beside it. Where's the outrage? Not for politics, but for the 6-year-olds no one claimed, for the quiet nurses who never stopped showing up, and for a border that had become something far more tragic than lines on a map. It had become the place where innocence bled into policy and disappeared. It happened not in the Senate chamber, not under cameras, but in a quiet corridor just outside the hearing room. JD had just exited a closed-door committee briefing, his notes still in hand, when someone called out behind him. "Senator Vance." He turned to see a familiar face. Senator Thomas Reyes, a moderate Democrat from Colorado. Known for his calm voice and cautious press statements, Reyes rarely spoke outside party lines, and certainly not to JD. JD slowed, but didn't stop. Reyes caught up, holding a slim folder. "I need a few minutes," Reyes said. JD raised an eyebrow but nodded. They ducked into an unused meeting room. The walls were lined with dusty charts from a forgotten infrastructure proposal. Reyes didn't sit, neither did JD. "I read your floor speech," Reyes began. "I don't agree with your tone." JD gave a faint, unsurprised smile. "I didn't expect you to. But I do agree," Reyes continued, opening the folder, "with your math." Inside were internal agency reports, ones JD hadn't yet seen. Charts linking fentanyl seizures to cross-border traffic spikes. Red dots on rural maps. One line stood out in thick ink. 72% of the identified overdose clusters traced back to known cartel routes. Reyes tapped the page. "I asked for this last month. Got buried under asylum priority memos." JD didn't say anything for a long moment. Then finally, "So you knew." "I suspected, but now I'm sure." JD leaned against the wall. The fluorescent lights above flickered faintly. "I'm not asking you to vote like me," JD said. "But I am asking, when this next bill hits the floor, don't pretend it's just about compassion." Reyes's jaw tightened. "My district includes migrant shelters. If I vote no, they'll say I've abandoned them." "If you vote yes," JD countered, "you may have to visit more funerals in counties you've never heard of." Reyes closed the folder, then offered a reluctant nod. "You've got 2 votes from my side, quiet ones, but they're real." JD extended his hand. "I'll take facts over applause any day." Reyes shook it. As the senator walked away, JD lingered in the empty room. He didn't feel victorious. Not exactly. But something had cracked. Not a party, not a policy, a silence. And it wasn't just families anymore. It wasn't just sheriffs or nurses or grieving parents. Now it was someone across the aisle. Someone who didn't agree with the tone, but couldn't ignore the truth. That's how things begin to move in Washington. Not with cheers, but with whispers. JD stepped back into the hallway and folded Reyes's copy into his own folder. The vote hadn't come yet, but for the first time, the numbers weren't just statistics on paper. They were changing hands in private rooms, under dusty charts, with voices that didn't need a microphone to matter. And that, he thought, was a start. The sign read, "Welcome to Chillicothe, Ohio. Population 21,926. JD Vance had been here once as a teenager, passing through on a trip with his uncle. It looked the same, dusty storefronts, a single Dairy Queen, and a downtown lined with brick buildings that hadn't changed since the 1950s. But what brought him here now wasn't nostalgia. It was 5 names, 5 kids, ages 14 to 19, dead in the last 12 months. Not one headline, not one news truck. Just grieving families and a police department overwhelmed by overdoses they couldn't stop, and a poison they couldn't trace fast enough. JD pulled into the lot behind the county health center. Inside, the staff looked exhausted. The director, a woman in her early 40s named Marlene, led him to a wall of laminated photos. "No major outlets covered this," she said. "We submitted data." No response. Each photo had a name, a birthday, and a short line. Cause of death: fentanyl toxicity. One boy had been captain of the high school soccer team. Another girl, Emily, was a straight-A student who played piano at her church. Her smile was the kind that made you stop mid-step. "They weren't drug addicts," Marlene said quietly. "They were kids who took a pill at a party. Just one." JD nodded slowly. "You traced the pills?" She handed him a folder. DEA lab flagged them: fentanyl and xylazine. Origin: border seizures in Arizona last year. Cartel signatures consistent. They're stamping them to look like Xanax and Percocet now. JD flipped through photos of the pills. They looked harmless. Some even had cheerful pastel coloring. "Why no media?" he asked. Marlene gave a sad, sharp smile. "It doesn't fit the narrative. These kids weren't in New York or San Francisco. They didn't die in a policy center. They died in backyards and parking lots." Outside, JD drove past a closed-down skating rink where one of the boys collapsed behind a dumpster. No plaque, no sign, just gravel and peeling paint. He parked and stepped out. The air was still. You could hear a dog barking from 2 blocks away. He looked around and said to no one in particular, "They were invisible to the people who write the rules." He took a photo of the shuttered building. Later, as he sat in his rental car, he wrote in his notebook, 5 lives, 0 headlines. Each pill crossed thousands of miles. Each story stopped right here. If we don't count them, we'll lose more than policy. We'll lose memory. Back in D.C., no one was waiting to interview him about Chillicothe. No one asked what he'd seen, but JD added 5 more names to the thick stack in his folder. This time he wrote, "Ohio Forgotten List," in pen at the top. He thought about the girl who played piano, the boy who ran track, the pill that traveled from Sinaloa to Arizona to a quiet town where no reporter had shown up in over a year. This wasn't a story that broke the news. It was a story that broke the silence, and JD was done letting it stay that way. The old firehouse in Gallia County hadn't seen this many people in years. Folding chairs were packed wall to wall, local press lining the back, and the scent of burnt coffee drifted through the room from a metal urn in the corner. J.D. Vance stood at the front, not with a podium, but behind a fold-out table, armed only with a stack of documents and a quiet, resolute expression. He had been invited to speak, but tonight wasn't about speeches. It was about grief. It started quietly enough. A few residents asked questions about Border Patrol resources and local rehab centers, but then a man in his late 50s, lean, sun-worn, wearing a denim jacket and pain in his eyes, stood up and raised his voice. "My son died last fall. Fentanyl. Bought it from a kid in town who got it from someone new across the river. You know what the paper said? Possible substance misuse." His voice cracked. "Why do we care more about people crossing illegally than the ones already buried here?" The room stirred. Some murmured, others nodded. He stepped forward. "I don't mean to sound cruel, but damn it, where was their compassion when my boy was dying on the bathroom floor?" A silence fell over the hall. No moderator stepped in. No aide rushed to calm the moment. JD didn't interrupt. Instead, he reached into the folder beside him and pulled out a sheet. Then another. Then another. Each had rows of names, ages, zip codes, overdose dates, counties from across Ohio, West Virginia, Pennsylvania. He didn't raise his voice. He just held the stack high and said, "This is what they didn't show you on CNN." Then he read, "Cameron, 17th Vinton County, pill laced with fentanyl. Lisa, 22nd Jackson Township, bought 1 tab at a college party. Troy, 15th Lawrence County, lured by Snapchat, dead in 30 minutes. The father sat back down, face in his hands. A mother clutched her purse to her chest. One man stared at the exit sign, as if trying to process how we had arrived at this place. JD continued, "These names aren't talking points. They're not part of a legislative compromise. They're proof that the line between policy and people is razor thin, and we're cutting ourselves on it every day. Someone asked quietly, "But what can you do?" JD took a breath. "We stop pretending the border crisis is only a Southern problem. We stop hiding behind slogans and ask where this poison starts and how it ends up in our neighborhoods. We treat it like the national emergency it is." He unfolded a laminated map, bright red pins scattered across the Midwest. "These are towns where fentanyl deaths have doubled in the last 3 years. Not near a port, not in a sanctuary city. Here, in your ZIP codes." The room remained still, not angry, not skeptical, just stunned. A teenage girl raised her hand. "If this keeps happening, will we ever be safe?" JD looked at her for a long moment before answering. "We can't guarantee perfect safety," he said, "but we sure as hell can guarantee someone in DC finally fights like it matters." He packed up slowly. No standing ovation, no applause. But one older woman slipped him a note folded into quarters. He read it outside under a street lamp. "We buried my grandson. First funeral since my husband's. Thank you for not looking away." That night, JD sat in his car and highlighted one line on the overdose list. Gallia County, 5 deaths, 12 months, 0 headlines. He added a 6th and drove in silence toward the next ZIP code. 2 weeks after the firehouse forum, J.D. Vance sat alone in his office well past midnight. The city outside hummed in half-sleep, but his desk was lit up with notes, names, and red lines circling counties on a national map. The pain he'd seen in Gallia, in Portsmouth, in far-off Yuma, it didn't fade when the cameras left. It clung to him. So he began writing. Not a speech this time. A bill. He called it the Border Integrity and Fentanyl Prevention Act. The language was simple, but its demand was radical in its clarity. Mandatory federal tracking of all known illegal border crossings tied to cartel networks, especially those with documented fentanyl trafficking patterns. It required real-time coordination between DHS, CBP, local law enforcement, and forensic narcotics units. It closed the gaps that allowed smugglers to vanish into silence. More controversially, the bill also pushed for mandatory congressional notification every time an overdose could be traced back to a known illegal trafficking route, forcing lawmakers to read names, not just stats. He didn't expect a standing ovation, and he didn't get one. The bill was blocked in committee within 3 days. Too aggressive, some said, too polarizing. But JD didn't back off. Instead, he hit the road again. He spoke at PTA meetings in West Virginia, did interviews on local AM radio in Tennessee, and handed out one-pagers at a Midwest opioid recovery center. The press mostly ignored it, but parents didn't. One letter came from a mother in Missouri. "I never thought someone in Washington would fight for us. Not just the policy, but the pain." Another from Arizona. "You have my full support. My brother's name is on your list." The movement began to stir, not from think tanks or influencers, but from basement vigils, funeral homes, and kitchen tables. By spring, over 600,000 signatures had poured into his office, each one scrawled with urgency. His staff taped 100 of them across the walls. One aide said softly, "They're not voters right now, they're survivors." JD reintroduced the bill. It failed again. But the margin had narrowed, and then something shifted. A center-left columnist wrote a surprising piece. J.D. Vance's proposal might be blunt, but it's the only thing that treats fentanyl like the war it is. Cable hosts who once ignored him began asking, "Is this the start of something bigger?" When asked if he was frustrated by the blocks, J.D. replied flatly, "Frustration is when your flight gets delayed. This is fury, controlled and focused." He returned to the Senate floor one more time with a new chart, not just overdose deaths, but cartel-affiliated crossing points from declassified reports. He held up a copy of the act. "If we can track stolen phones within minutes, don't tell me we can't track who's trafficking death into our communities." A few senators looked down. One nodded. It hadn't passed yet, but it had a pulse. And this time, the halls of Congress weren't the only ones echoing. The light in J.D. Vance's Senate office was always a little warmer now, intentionally dimmed, filtered through frosted glass. He didn't want it to feel sterile anymore. He didn't want it to feel like Washington. Across the far wall, stretching from waist to ceiling, was a silent monument of paper and grief. It had started with one photograph, Angela's son from Portsmouth. But over the months, the wall had grown. It now held nearly 100 faces, sons, daughters, siblings, some smiling in graduation caps, others caught mid-laugh on birthday mornings. Some were just toddlers. Names were written in soft black ink beneath each image, with birth and death years that hurt to read. In between the portraits were things only J.D. understood the weight of. A blurry map marked in red lines, known cartel corridors that slip past the Arizona fence, aerial photos of stash houses, intercepted blueprint sketches of a tunnel discovered near San Diego, a border patrol patch from Yuma, the funeral program of a boy who never made it to 20. Pinned in the center, surrounded by these fragments of stories lost and lives altered, was the photo J.D. had kept close for months, the 10-year-old girl from Ohio. She wore a teal dress, hair pulled back in two neat braids. A glittering unicorn was printed on the corner of her shirt. She'd taken that picture at a birthday party 2 weeks before she mistook fentanyl-laced candy for a sweet treat. She had become the face of his fight, not by politics, but by pain. Beneath her picture, hand-lettered in clean block letters on reclaimed wood, read the sentence J.D. had carved himself one night in silence. They crossed illegally. Their poison stayed. He didn't add his name. This wasn't about him anymore. Every now and then, visitors would glance at the wall and freeze. Some nodded slowly. Others turned away, blinking fast. One senator had walked in for a quick meeting on a trade amendment and stood in front of the wall for 3 full minutes, speechless. "I didn't know," he whispered. J.D. only replied, "They did." Above the desk, not far from the wall, sat a single folder, marked with the revised version of the Border Integrity and Fentanyl Prevention Act. It had new co-signers now, bipartisan, barely, but real. When staffers asked whether the collage should be moved before press events, J.D. shook his head. "Leave it," he said. "If they want to talk policy, they can look at what the policies have done." Sometimes when the building emptied and the marble floors echoed with quiet, J.D. would sit alone on the couch in the corner and stare at the wall. He'd look at the tunnel sketches and remember the coyotes' footprints in the sand near Yuma. He'd trace the routes on the map and think of Angela's broken voice. And he'd look at the girl's picture and remember silence, 21 seconds of it on the Senate floor. It had never left him. He didn't know if the bill would pass in time, or if all of America would ever care as much as Portsmouth or Gallia did. But he knew this much. The wall would remain. A record no one could edit. A memory no one could spin. And if they ever tried to erase it again, they'd have to tear it down brick by brick. The morning light filtering into J.D. Vance's office was softer than usual, casting long amber streaks across the wooden floor. The collage on the wall stood quietly behind him as he sorted through a growing stack of constituent letters, some angry, most grateful, all deeply personal. There was a quiet knock. J.D. looked up. A young woman, no more than 23, stood at the doorway, nervous, polite, wearing a navy blue staff badge clipped to a blazer just a shade too big for her. She stepped in cautiously, clutching a folder. "I'm sorry, Senator. I don't mean to interrupt." J.D. smiled gently. "You're not. Come in." She crossed the room carefully, her hand gripping the folder like it carried something heavier than paper. J.D. noticed a slight tremble in her fingers. Not fear exactly, but something closer to memory. "I'm Maya. I just started as an intern with the judiciary team. 3rd year from Penn State," she said, then paused. "But that's not really why I came." J.D. tilted his head. "Go on." She took a breath. "My dad was an ICE agent. He was stationed in Laredo. He died 2 years ago during a sting operation on a fentanyl convoy moving through cartel territory. The paperwork said it was an ambush. They said it was quick. But it never felt finished, Senator. It never felt like people understood what he died for." J.D. put down his pen. "I watched your speech last fall. The one after the funeral in Portsmouth. You held up that little girl's picture, and you said, 'This isn't just about drugs. It's about the people who tried to stop them and never got heard.'" She looked up, eyes glistening but steady. "You said that, And for the first time, it felt like someone saw my dad. JD didn't interrupt. Maya continued, her voice quiet but clear. My mom cried that night. She hadn't cried since the burial. But she cried when she heard you say those words. Because it wasn't about politics, it was about dignity. Silence held for a few seconds. Then JD leaned forward slightly, nodding once. He served, he said, voice low but firm. I just spoke. Maya smiled softly and placed the folder on his desk. This is the research packet you asked for. I highlighted the ICE casualty records we talked about. Some names are still redacted, but I figured you'd want to know them anyway. JD nodded. Thank you, Maya. As she turned to leave, her eyes drifted to the wall behind him. Her breath caught. She saw the photos, the maps, the tunnel sketches, the obituary programs. But her gaze stopped at the center, where the little girl's face looked out quietly from beneath the carved wooden plaque. Maya stared at it for a long moment, then whispered more to herself than to JD. They crossed illegally. Their poison stayed. JD said nothing. He didn't have to. As the door clicked shut behind her, he sat still for a moment, letting the weight of the encounter settle. Sometimes the grandest things in politics didn't happen in committee rooms or under flashing cameras. Sometimes they walked in quietly, in the form of a young woman with trembling fingers and a memory worth honoring. He turned back to the letters on his desk, but now with a deeper steadiness. He wasn't just fighting a policy, he was carrying legacies. The studio lights were warmer than expected, casting a quiet glow across the table. JD Vance sat calmly, hands clasped, his demeanor steady but not rigid. Across from him sat a journalist known more for nuance than confrontation. A welcome change after months of headlines that screamed louder than they listened. The interview had moved through the expected. Policy fallout, bipartisan friction, the mounting overdose numbers. But now, with cameras still rolling and the air in the room slightly more still, the journalist leaned in, voice softened, not for drama, but for something closer to curiosity. Senator Vance, she asked, you knew your words would ignite a firestorm. If given the chance, would you say it again? JD didn't flinch. He held her gaze for a beat, the silence not a hesitation, but a quiet choosing of truth. I wouldn't just say it again, he answered. I'd say it louder. The room held its breath for a moment, not because of the force of the answer, but because of its clarity. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't pride. It was a line spoken by someone who had counted names, shaken hands with grieving parents, stood in town halls where pain echoed louder than applause. There were no follow-up questions. None were needed. Outside, the world would spin its commentary, some calling it courage, others labeling it cruelty. But inside that room, what remained was not the politics of the answer, but the permanence of its weight. Because long after the microphones faded and the headlines moved on, one truth lingered like a low hum through the country's conscience. The line that crossed the border hadn't been drawn in sand. It had been drawn in blood, and some voices once raised couldn't be unheard. This story isn't just about policy, it's about presence. JD Vance didn't speak to win applause. He spoke to give voice to those no longer able to speak for themselves. Whether you agree with his politics or not, his stand reminds us of a deeper truth. Leadership isn't volume, it's conviction. The names on his wall weren't statistics. They were children, siblings, neighbors, people. His refusal to back down, even under fire, challenges us to ask not what's popular, but what's right. Sometimes courage is simply saying what no one else will. Question for you. If your voice could carry truth through the noise, would you use it even if it cost you everything? If this story touches you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to JD Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching JD Stories.